The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was a hollow bronze statue used in ancient Greece. Victims were locked inside while a fire roasted them alive. Screams echoed through pipes, sounding like a bull's roar. Invented by Paralas, he became its first victim as punishment for his cruelty. Scaphism. The boats. Persian Scaphism tied victims between two boats, force-fed milk and honey, and left in a swamp. Insects and animals slowly devoured them. Death took days from dehydration, sepsis, or shock. The punishment aimed to maximize suffering without direct execution. The Blood Eagle. Vikings allegedly performed the Blood Eagle on traitors. Ribs were severed from the spine, and lungs pulled out to resemble wings. Historians debate its Junshishing, but its brutality symbolizes Norse revenge culture. Lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts. Used in China until 1905, Lingchi involved slowly slicing off body parts. It combined torture and public humiliation, often for treason. The goal was to erase the victim's body and soul, denying an afterlife. The Judas Cradle. A pyramid-shaped seat suspended victims above a spike. Lowered repeatedly, the tip caused severe tearing. Used during the Inquisition, it targeted heretics and left many dead from infection or blood loss. The Pear of Anguish. This metal device, shaped like a pear, was inserted into mouths, vaginas, or anuses. When expanded, it ripped internal tissue. Used in medieval Europe to punish blasphemers, adulterers, and liars. The Spanish Tickler. A claw-like tool shredded flesh from bones. Popular during the Spanish Inquisition, it flayed victims alive for heresy or witchcraft. Survivors often died from shock or gangrene. The Breaking Wheel. Victims were tied to a wheel and limbs smashed with iron bars. Some were left to die slowly, others woven through spokes. Used in Europe for thieves and murderers until the 1800s. Rat torture. Rats were placed on a victim's stomach, trapped under a cage. Heat applied above forced rats to gnaw through flesh to escape. Common in medieval Europe to extract confessions. The Heretic's Fork. A two-pronged fork pinned the throat and chest. Victims couldn't sleep or speak without self-impalement. Used during the Inquisition to force repentance from accused heretics. The Iron Maiden. A coffin-like device with inward spikes closed slowly on the victim. Though likely a Victorian myth, it symbolizes medieval Europe's reputation for sadistic justice. Crocodile shears. In parts of Africa, red-hot iron shears mutilated thieves' fingers or tongues. The searing pain cauterized wounds, prolonging agony. Used to deter crime through visible disfigurement. The Spanish Donkey. A wooden wedge forced victims to straddle it while weights dragged them downward. The pressure split the body over hours. Used for adultery or desertion in colonial armies. Keel hauling. Sailors were dragged under a ship's hull, shredded by barnacles and drowned. Dutch and British navies used this for insubordination. Many died from drowning or blood loss. The Catherine Wheel. Victims' limbs were broken and woven through wheel spokes. Raised on a pole, they took days to die. Used in Europe for highwaymen and traders. The lead sprinkler. Molten lead, oil, or wax poured onto victims' skin. Popular in medieval Europe for arsonists. The punishment mirrored the crime. Burn the burner. The saw torture. Victims were hung upside down and sawn in half. Prolonged blood flow to the head delayed unconsciousness. Used in the Middle East and Europe for witchcraft or sacrilege. Bamboo torture. Bamboo shoots grow rapidly. Victims tied above them were impaled as the stalks pierced their bodies. A slow, natural execution method in Southeast Asia. The coffin torture. Victims were stuffed into metal cages barely larger than their bodies. Left in public, they died from dehydration, exposure, or animal attacks. Common in medieval Europe. The head crusher. A device squeezed the skull until the eyes burst and teeth shattered. Used in Europe to extract confessions. Survivors faced permanent disfigurement or insanity. Spanish water torture. Water was forced down a victim's throat via funnel until the stomach swelled. Guards then jumped on the abdomen. Used during interrogations for fast confessions. Impalement. Vlad the Impaler's signature punishment, a greased stake inserted slowly to avoid immediate death. Victims took hours to die, designed to terrify enemies and suppress rebellion. Ordeal by boar. Victims were tied down while starving boars ate their entrails, an ancient Mesopotamian punishment for treason. Death came from shock or blood loss. Flaying. Skin was peeled off in strips using knives. Assyrians used this to punish rebels. Some victims survived days without skin, dying from infection or exposure. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. English traders were hanged until half dead, disemboweled, and chopped into pieces. Body parts displayed publicly to deter dissent. Last used in 1803, burning at the stake. Victims were tied to a post and burned alive, common for witches and heretics in Europe. Smoke inhalation often killed before flames. The garrote, a collar tightened around the neck until the spine snapped. Used in Spain for executions until 1978. Quick but grisly, the tongue tearer. Pliers ripped out tongues of blasphemers. In some cases, hot irons cauterized the wound to prolong life for further torture. The punishment of the sack. Adulterers in ancient Rome were sewn into sacks with animals, snakes, monkeys, and thrown into rivers. A moral execution, blending drowning and mauling, the pillory. Victims locked in wooden stocks faced public humiliation. Crowds threw rocks, rotten food, or excrement. Some died from injuries or infections. The drunkard's cloak, a barrel-shaped garment, forced alcoholics to parade through towns. The weight and shame aimed to cure addiction through humiliation. The ducking stool, women accused of gossip or witchcraft were tied to a chair and dunked in water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they drowned. Foot roasting. Feet were coated in oil and roasted over flames, used in the Middle East to extract confessions. Survivors lost limbs to gangrene. The Spanish spider. A hooked tool ripped flesh from backs in strips. Named for its claw-like appearance, it left victims scarred or dead from blood loss. Trial by ordeal. Medieval Europe used divine judgment, holding hot irons or retrieving stones from boiling water. Infected burns proved guilt. Curbing. Victims' mouths were forced open with curb bits, horse tools, shattering teeth. Used on slaves and rebels in colonial Americas. The scold's bridle. A metal muzzle with spikes silenced nagging women. Worn in public, it caused bleeding and starvation. Common in 16th century Britain, the Spanish mantle. A spiked metal collar immobilized victims. Any movement pierced the neck. Used during interrogations to force stillness and compliance. The punishment of the snakes. Victims were thrown into pits of venomous snakes. Used in ancient Egypt for grave robbers. Death came from bites or terror. White torture. Modern sensory deprivation. White rooms, no sound and isolation. Victims hallucinate or go mad. Used to break political prisoners psychologically. Electrocution. Electric chairs caused agonizing deaths via burned organs and tissue. Some survived multiple shocks before dying. A humane method now deemed cruel. Chemical castration. Drugs suppress libido, often forcibly administered. Used on sex offenders, it causes depression and osteoporosis. Controversial as ethical punishment. The bastinado. A brutal form of foot whipping used across the Middle East and Asia. Victims' bare soles were beaten with rods, canes, or whips until the flesh split. The feat's sensitivity made it excruciating, often leaving permanent damage. Common for extracting confessions or punishing thieves. The strappado. Medieval Europe's reverse hanging. Victims' hands were tied behind their backs and hoisted by ropes, dislocating shoulders. Sometimes weights were added to legs, used during the Inquisition to force heresy confessions. Many died from shock or internal injuries. Peine forte et dure. A pressing torture from England. Victims were laid under boards while heavy stones piled atop them. Refusing to plead in court triggered this punishment. Bodies were crushed slowly, with some taking days to die. The sweating. Victims were locked in tiny, airless cells heated by fires. Used in 18th century Britain for prisoners awaiting trial, it induced dehydration, hallucinations, and suffocation. Many confessed to crimes just to escape. The boot. A leg-crushing device filled the gap between knee and ankle with wedges. Hammers drove the wedges inward, shattering bones. Popular in Scotland for interrogating witches and rebels. The knee splitter. A vice-like tool with spikes gripped victims' knees. Tightening the device destroyed joints and cartilage. Used in Renaissance Europe to cripple deserters or blasphemers. The breast ripper. A clawed instrument for women accused of adultery, heresy, or abortion. Red-hot claws tore off breasts. Survivors were scarred or died from infection. Common in medieval Germany. Thumbscrews. A simple but effective device. Metal bars crushed thumbs or fingers, used globally to force confessions. Bones splintered and nerves were destroyed, leaving hands useless. The cat's paw. A clawed glove ripped flesh from backs in jagged strips. Named for its resemblance to animal scratches, it left victims mutilated. Favored by pirates and European torturers. The Spanish windlass. A rope was tied around the victim's body and twisted with a stick, compressing organs and breaking ribs. Used during colonial conquests to punish rebels. The Siberian stake. In freezing Russian winters, victims were impaled on wooden stakes and left to die from exposure. The cold slowed blood loss, prolonging agony for days. Tar and feathering. A humiliation tactic. Victims were doused in hot tar, rolled in feathers, and paraded through towns. Skin peeled off with the tar, causing severe burns. Popular in colonial America for tax protesters. Japanese bamboo splinter torture. Thin bamboo slivers were driven under fingernails or into flesh. As bamboo grew inside the body, it caused internal bleeding and infection. Used for spies in feudal Japan. Indian elephant execution. Trained elephants crushed victims' limbs or heads underfoot. Some elephants were taught to dismember bodies, a spectacle of power in Mughal courts.